If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Beer is a resource-intensive product, consuming several times its volume in water just in the brewing process, but there are other areas where breweries and home brewers can look to reduce consumption with an increased focus on sustainability. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Caitlin Singer, who's Quality and Sustainability Manager at Georgetown Brewing Company in Seattle, Washington, and it is literally part of Caitlin's job to ask questions and find solutions to make Georgetown Brewing a more sustainable brewery. They already have a commitment to sustainability at Georgetown, but Caitlin's passion and commitment has resulted in a number of innovative programs like soft plastics recycling and utility benchmarking, and many of the things that Caitlin and Georgetown have accomplished are applicable to breweries across the country. So in an effort to share her knowledge, Caitlin put together a poster at the Brewing Summit in August 2022 about practical applications of sustainability with real examples and advice for brewers. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We'll start by talking about sustainability conversations with management, about appointing a champion and such, and then we'll move on to some real solutions that you might or might not have considered for your brewery, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas that you can take away from this episode. Now, this is a practical episode, so we won't get too much into the science, but again, my hope is that you come away with a few specific practical applications of sustainability that you can apply to your brewery. And as we move into the holiday season, I'm reminded of all the things I'm thankful for, which includes Marshall and all the crew here at Brewlosophy, all of our listeners, and all of our patrons. If you haven't yet considered becoming a patron, please visit patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By becoming a patron, you'll be directly supporting the work we do here at Brewlosophy, which includes an experiment and a secondary series written article every week, like the Hop Chronicles, Brew It Yourself, Short and Shoddy, plus 2 podcasts, the Brewlosophy podcast and the Brew Lab. And if you become a patron, you get access to unique rewards, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, a monthly live Q&A session with somebody from the industry, and much, much more. Your support through Patreon helps keep all of this going, so thank you to those who have already joined. And if you haven't, please consider it by visiting patreon.com/Brewlosophy. As I mentioned, it's officially the holiday season. I've got my lights and tree up, and I've started thinking about gifts for my friends and family. And like many this time of year, I avoid crowded stores by shopping online, which I do by starting with the links listed at brewlosophy.com/support. It's such an easy way to support us, and it doesn't impact your shopping experience at all. You just start with a link, and then we get a small kickback from your purchases. You can check out all of our affiliates at brewlosophy.com/support. All right, feedback this week is brought to you by the team at Haas, who are constantly innovating to provide solutions to your brewing problems. We've all had hazy IPAs, and since you're listening to this show, you know that getting a stable haze can be a challenge. Imagine you've brewed this awesome hazy IPA, you've added your Whirlpool and dry hops, it's looking great while fermenting, and then it drops crystal clear after you crash it. Well, the folks at Haas have you covered. Introducing Hop Haze, their newest brewing product. Hop Haze can be used in post-fermentation to add a stable hazy complexion to beer and other beverages. It's 100% hop-derived, flavorless in beer, and requires no additional mixing before use, and the haze stability is the same as the shelf life of your beer. So if you want to achieve that juicy look in your next hazy IPA, be sure to try Hop Haze. And also check out all the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, a few episodes back, listener Dylan wrote in about episode 62, carbon to nitrogen ratios and yeast propagation with Dr. Maria Mutsoglu. There were a few more questions that we didn't get to in that feedback session, so I'm going to answer those now. As a reminder, Dylan says, I just listened to episode 62 on carbon and nitrogen for yeast propagation with Dr. Maria Mutsoglu, then read the paper and had some questions about the practical application of the information. He says, using a 2 Plato 1 to 10 carbon to nitrogen propagation fermentation media resulted in more efficient production of, quote, better yeast, which sounds amazing, but how do I apply this to my home brewing? He says, I'll skip over some of the stuff from last episode. He mentions some different cell counts and how to calculate exactly the number of cells that he's going to achieve. But then he asks, despite being more carbon efficient, the low Plato media had lower total cell yields than the high Plato media. So should I be making a larger starter? And he also asks, how big an impact does initial pitch rate into the starter have? So 2 questions here. Should he be making a larger starter? And how much of an impact does the initial amount of yeast that goes into the starter have on the outcome? So yeah, I mean, we'll start with larger starter first, and that's really the question, right? I mean, if yeast are primed and ready to go, do you need to match the initial pitch rate of a traditionally propagated yeast? Meaning, like, let's say you need 200 billion cells, for your ale, 1040 ale. Or 10 Plato ale, you need 200 billion cells in a 5-gallon batch or 20-liter batch. Do you really need 200 billion cells? I mean, if you look at the table from Dr. Mutsuglu's paper, then yes, it's very clear that the lower carbon or the lower Plato media had a lower total cell count, but she did see better fermentation outcomes, as you mentioned, quote, better yeast in the low Plato media. So exactly what number of cells is needed and how does pitch rate matter? And so this is a question that I think isn't answered yet, but it would be interesting to see some results. Like, for example, if you pitched equal numbers of cells of the low Plato versus high Plato media, then you essentially should see a replicate of Dr. Mutsuglu's results, because that's what she did. She took 100, I think it was 100 million cells per mil per degree Plato, or a million cells per mil per degree Plato, I think is what she did. I'd have to go back and reference the paper. But in any event, she pitched equal amounts of cells, equal numbers of cells from the low Plato and high Plato media. If you wanted to see something a little bit different, you could pitch a disparate number of cells like I did in my experiment on this topic. And in that case, the question's a little bit more murky, right? There were definitely a lower number of cells, but I still saw positive fermentation outcomes from a lower pitch rate. What that pitch rate is, I don't know, but really all that means is we need more experimentation. It's really cool stuff, and there's really a lot of room for homebrewers especially to take this and run with it and see what happens. Commercial brewers aren't going to be interested in dumping huge volumes of tanks if it's not successful, but homebrewers, you got some ability to play around and see and tweaking and figure out what works for you. And Dylan, if you've already completed some tests, please send me the results. I'd love to read them as feedback for a later episode. All right, let's talk sustainability. Give me a few minutes and I'll be back with Caitlin Singer, Quality and Sustainability Manager at Georgetown Brewing Company.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
On a recent episode, I mentioned that biotransformation and thiols are hot topics for brewers, but sustainability is also up there. There's definitely been an increased focus on sustainable decision-making for brewers, largely driven by potential competitive advantages and consumer interest. And today in the lab, I'm speaking with Caitlin Singer, Quality and Sustainability Manager at Georgetown Brewing Company in Seattle, Washington. So Caitlin, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Hi, Cade. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to spread the good word about sustainability.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad to have you here. And I mean, your title literally is Sustainability Manager. And one, that's awesome that your brewery has that commitment, right? I don't know very many people who can say that they're sustainability managers of breweries. I guess a question that I have is like, how much time do you spend actually thinking about sustainability?
Oh my gosh, Cade. I would spend 100% of my time thinking about sustainability if I could.
Right.
But in reality, I do have other things I need to think about. I also manage the quality program at Georgetown, so I'm having fun expanding that program as well.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I can imagine, right? Like, how much fun would it be to just like think about, how to improve sustainability at the brewery? I mean, that'd be really cool and like really meaningful work too, right? To be able to like make changes, or be empowered to be the person that's responsible for making sure that the brewery's operating as sustainably as it can be. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so. And plus, people get really jazzed about it.
Yeah.
People like to help.
That's right. I mean, you were there with me at the Brewing Summit in August. Mm-hmm. We both had posters, and that's kind of where I met you. And that's your poster is actually what we're going to be talking about today on this episode. But that was the big focus of the Brewing Summit was sustainability. I mean, there were so many different, presentations and posters and everything looking at sustainability. And I really loved yours. The thing that I loved the most about yours was the practical applications, right? I mean, that was the title of the poster, and it was so cool. We'll get to all that in just a second, but I did want to sort of briefly introduce you. So again, quality and sustainability manager at Georgetown Brewing. But I always want to ask this question. So what got you interested in brewing? And I'll tag on also sustainability.
Okay, so my journey into the craft beer rabbit hole is a lot like most people's, I think. I really just kind of fell into it. I had graduated from school and totally did not want to use my degree. And so I started pouring beer at a spot near my house, until I figured out what my real job was going to be. And then I moved across the street to a different brewery, Fremont Brewing, actually. And I poured beer there initially. And then not too far into my time there, one of the brewers decided to establish a lab and a quality program. And I asked if I could help. So it turns out I did want to put my biology degree to use.
Okay.
In a very practical way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I worked in the lab there for a little while. And then I actually took a little beer sabbatical and went farming for a few years. But
fun.
Skipping over that,
Farming what? Now I'm curious.
Oh, vegetables.
Oh, okay. All right. Vegetables.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was out of the beer world totally.
Okay.
And then I found myself at Georgetown Brewing, where I really followed the same path. I started pouring beer, and I just love the craft beer community. I hear its sirens call, and I can't resist it.
I don't blame you. Yeah, so pouring beer then at Georgetown, and then how the transition into quality and sustainability.
Okay, so I was pouring beer, and then I was interested in the lab, and I asked if I could help out, and it just kind of transitioned into me working in the lab more and then working in the lab full time. And then I also created the sustainability position for myself because that is something that's really been a thread throughout all of my career in life. As I've always been interested in sort of, not wasting water and just not being wasteful in general.
Yeah.
And I know I used to drive my mom nuts because she'd turn the water on the faucet to, defrost some meat in the sink or something, and I would turn it off. I'd be like, you're wasting it.
Right. That's something I've always found too, right? Like the drip defrosting of meat. Like you're supposed to just keep it dripping and drip, drip, drip. And I'm always like, that's just kind of gross. It's like a tepid pool of water there and meat inside of it. But anyway, we digress. We're talking about beer.
Yes.
But that's cool. So an awesome job for creating a position for yourself based on what you want, right? I mean, that certainly speaks to me, and I'm glad to hear that there are people doing that in the brewing industry, right? You don't have to fit into these, predetermined positions. If there's something that you want to do and something you want to contribute to the brewery, you can make that happen. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did through this sustainability position. All right, well, we're going to ask a lot more questions about that sustainability position, but I wanted to sort of quickly go over the roadmap. And so again, this was a poster presentation that you did at Brewing Summit, and here's a quote from the poster that I think defines exactly what I want to do in this episode. You said in that poster, "My goal is for the reader to have plenty of inspiration and tools to begin or elevate their sustainability program." Full stop. I think that's just the best way of saying this. So I want listeners to have inspiration and tools to begin or elevate their sustainability mission. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about that. And we'll start on, where do you start? Where do you go from there? Like once you've started, what do you do with information that you collect? And then what's the future? What are some things that we can look forward to? So we have to start though by answering the question, what does sustainability mean to you? And then maybe I'll also ask a question, what does it mean to Georgetown Brewing?
Sure. So good question. So to me, sustainability means asking, how are we able to sustain ourselves as individuals, as a brewery, as a community, as a planet? So on the large scale, there is an obvious and glaring need to be more environmentally responsible. How do we reduce our footprint? And that's kind of the thing that people think of when they think of sustainability, the environmental aspect, reducing emissions, resource use, waste, etc. As a community, it also involves, how do we take care of each other? How do we help people who need help, and what causes are important to us? As a brewery, how do we keep ourselves afloat? This has a financial component, but also looking at optimizing methods and processes, maybe getting more automated. And then looking inward, how do we take care of ourselves and each other at the brewery? How do owners and managers take care of people working for them? It's more than just the basic benefits like 401k and paid time off. It's
right. Yeah.
checking in with each other, and making sure we're all doing okay. And if not, how do we get there?
Oh, I love that aspect, the sustainable workforce aspect of it. That's a really cool part of it.
Yeah, for me, there's definitely a social component to sustainability, and I think that really gets lost in the mix sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're always thinking about like, sustainability. The first thing I think is like you sort of mentioned with water with your mom, right? With the defrosting of meat. It's like, how do we use less water, right? And I think there's been a big push on that. I mean, you look at all the stuff that Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors have done, and, New Belgium, and, some of these big regional and super regional breweries, Sierra Nevada. I mean, great examples of, moving from whatever that 10 barrels of water per barrel of beer that was sort of industry standard down to like 2 or 3 barrels of water per barrel of beer. So there's all of that stuff. But you're right. The sustainability aspect of the workforce is something that does sort of get lost. Sometimes it gets like, in the wash or tossed out with the wastewater.
Yeah, I think the financial component too. I think that's the part people don't really want to think about, but ultimately that is very important for keeping the program going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you'll hear me say this a couple times through the podcast, but that was a big takeaway. I don't remember who it was that had this quote, and maybe it was several people at the Brewing Summit, but they said for sustainability to actually be implemented, there has to be one, it has to serve a sustainability purpose, right? It's got to help somehow, but it can't hurt. Right, it can't hurt the brewery. People, it's hard for brewers. Brewers are already not making very much money or profit on what they're doing, and so if you're asking them to pay more money in order to save something, that's a hard ask, right? So it has to help the environment, or it has to achieve a sustainability goal. It's got to be cost effective, right, and so useful. And then there's got to be something. There's like a feel good aspect of it too, right? Like it's this gestalt part, right? Like where it all just like gels together and feels good, and you've got this ability to sort of move sustainability forward. And I guess a question off of that line of thinking is why should sustainability be important to Georgetown Brewing, for example?
Yeah, so sustainability is efficiency, and efficiency is sustainability. So when you're just talking about being sustainable, it's not just, I want to help the earth and I want to make sure, certain species are alive in 100 years. Like, yes, that's totally important, but also what keeps Georgetown Brewing afloat? What keeps us going? And that's where really the financial part of it comes in. Yeah. If we can't take care of ourselves, how do we take care of our community? And likewise, if looking at the workforce sustainability, if we can't keep ourselves motivated and energized, we're going to burn out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's totally true, right? The efficiency part of it as well. And I mean, I think that's where sustainability decisions become easy, whenever you can see something that cuts costs and it makes you feel good about the planet, right? And feel like you're doing something good and sustainable. That's where sustainability decisions, I think, are easy to make. But you make a good point that like this is a complicated picture. It's not just one thing. It's not like, okay, we've got LED lights now, done. We've met our sustainability goal for the year. It's way more than that. There's a whole lot of things that can be done. And the first thing that you mention in your poster is that a brewery should appoint a sustainability champion. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So the first thing you need is someone really leading the way, leading the effort, voicing the need, and doing the work. So for me, that's me. For Georgetown, that's me.
Right.
I always find myself sort of in this position where I'm like, well, what if we use less waste or produce less waste? And it just feels very natural for me. So yeah, the sustainability champion, that's like step one. And then if you got someone there who's excited about it, it's easy. So hopefully that's the case.
Yeah, that's true. Finding somebody that's excited about it might be difficult. And I think there's also an aspect of this too, that it's like finding somebody that's comfortable raising their hand, right? And saying something, right? Like like you said with your mom with the water, you go in there and turn the water off. It's, I can't imagine like somebody shutting off the cold water tank or the hot water tank, when the brewer's using it or spraying it. But, that's a bad example. But you do need somebody to sort of sit in those conversations and raise their hand and go like, well, wait, if we do brew this, double dry hopped milkshake IPA with, 300 pounds of fruit puree thrown in, that's going to be a great beer, but holy crap, like what's our waste going to be, and what's the cost, going to be for recycling, and what are we putting in our wastewater whenever it's, this stuff settles out, are we having like actual seeds that we're just blowing into the drain? So you got all these sorts of questions, and you have somebody there that can do that and can raise the hand. So is that sort of the role of the sustainability champion, or are they like auditor or monitor, driver, manager, all the above?
Yeah, I think it's really what you make it. I've seen lots of people with the role of sustainability manager or coordinator, and it's like, well, you have to be more specific, because that could mean, maybe you're more of a marketing role, or you're an engineer. There's a lot of engineers doing sustainability, and so they're really working on equipment. There's someone like me who is more interested in sort of like building out the program at the brewery and kind of the bigger picture, like what does it mean to brew in a circular way?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question too. Like what is, that's the first time I think I've heard it described that way. What does it mean to brew in a circular way?
Oh boy, I'm glad you asked. I just went to the Master Brewers Brewing and Malting Science course.
Oh, fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. I just finished it. So shout out to the Madison kids 2022. And one of the components is a final project. And I asked a really big question that I really had no business talking about yet, but it was, how do you create a circular brewery? And I'm still thinking about it.
Well, sure. Yeah. I was going to say, if you figured that out, you need to stop. Don't mention it on this podcast. Write a book and start selling it. but no, I'm just kidding. Please share.
Well, the devil's really in the details there, because, you can't, there isn't just one way to build a brewery. So it's got to be high enough level that everyone can adapt it, but detailed enough that it's actually meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that. So is brewing in a circular manner? Sorry, so this we're going off on a tangent here, but I think it's a good one, right? But brewing in a circular manner is just like, what's the goal there? Is the goal like that I don't know, I'm just gonna throw this, like wastewater from the fermenter or something gets pumped back into some process somewhere and used again in brewing, or is the goal like, one barrel of water comes out as one barrel of beer?
It's probably somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah.
I'd say largely the goal is just resilience. What works. It's reducing your water usage and recycling it so you can reuse it in the next brew.
Yeah. Or it's thinking about everything in a circular relationship, right? It's like,
Yes.
where is this going, right? So I've got a bucket of fruit puree, and I know I'm putting that in my beer, right? And that's what, and so I've got this waste product. I have this bucket. Where's the bucket go? Where did the fruit come from? What is the circular relationship of all of these ingredients? And an important part of this is communication too, right? Is somebody that's willing not only to raise their hand and look at, ways to improve sustainability, but that person's also the person that's the driver of communicating out to the world what the brewery is doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I like that your point you brought up about inputs and also what happens after your beer leaves the facility, because you don't have a lot of control over that. So how can you be circular if you're bringing stuff in and exporting stuff out?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's just, a theoretical model at this point, but I think there's definitely some practical applications there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, right. There's a theoretical model there, but that's an aspiration, right? That's how things start. You start by thinking about things that way. It becomes a mission, and then you start making and doing, chipping away at little pieces. And so that's kind of one of the questions. This kind of segues into what we're going to talk about in a little bit in terms of like baselining and benchmarking. But before we get there, I wanted to ask, how do you convince management to make sustainability decisions? What are those discussions like? What goes into that stuff?
So when I first pitched the role of a dedicated sustainability person, the selling point really did come down to money. I told Manny, who's one of the owners of Georgetown, I told him I would save him money. I said I would audit the brewery and see if there were any leaks or maintenance issues that we could fix and reduce waste and therefore save us money. And I will say that didn't really happen. Sorry, Manny, because, well, Georgetown has really been walking the sustainability walk for almost 20 years now. So we're really good about that kind of stuff because, like I said earlier, sustainability is efficiency. So we're not just hopefully we're not just letting water drip endlessly. And, we fix leaks. And we actually have a dedicated person for that now who's got a very pleasing spreadsheet. But I do think that is a good place to start for anyone looking to pitch a sustainability role. Because, especially for a younger brewery, it's going to be a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that makes sense too, right? Like, what ways can you improve costs immediately for the brewery? Again, like I mentioned earlier, there's got to be a cost component to it. Everyone would love to put solar panels on their brewery, I think, and have solar energy because it's, potentially cheaper in the long run. But that capital outlay of solar panels has to come from somewhere. Somebody's got to brew the beer to make that solar panel investment or borrow money or wherever. So it's got to make sense from a business perspective as well. And that's really interesting. So all right, so let's take that then. Like when you came to Manny and you said, "Hey, I want to save the brewery money," what sorts of evidence did you have to show him in order to do that?
I think the two things I came to him with were the Brewers Association's benchmarking tool that I'd filled out. I'd gotten access to the utility bills and I was able to fill that out and get some numbers and able to compare us to other breweries of our size range and show him, hey, this is what we're doing well and this is where we have opportunity. And he had a general idea of that, like we know we could improve wastewater. But for him to actually see numbers, I think that was meaningful for him. Yeah,
I think that's awesome. And another great quote from your poster: "You can't manage what you don't measure." Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems that's like really obvious, right? I mean, you're measuring the amount of grain that goes into your recipe. You're measuring, the protein contents and the diastatic power and all this stuff on malt. For yeast, you're looking at viability and vitality. You're measuring all these things, but then we sort of forget about the electricity bill. It just kind of gets some of us. I think some brewers forget about the electricity bill. The managers, the people who are writing the checks and paying the bills, they're thinking about electricity and they're thinking about gas use and they're thinking about all of the overhead that they've got to cover in order to make good beer. But you mentioned a really important thing there, right? And that's benchmarking. And you mentioned the Brewers Association's benchmarking tool. Talk to us about benchmarking and baselining.
Sure. So like you said, or like I said, you can't manage what you don't measure, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know who that quote is originally attributed to.
It's from you now.
It's my justification for everything, though.
Yeah.
So, so I used that benchmarking tool, and that was a really good project for me, sort of in the slower times when I was still in retail and I was trying to find something to do. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. And I don't even know how I found that thing. But it was, like I said, really good for visualizing where we're at and how we compare to others, and just seeing how efficient we are, which turns out is like, we're not that bad.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a big part of it, right? I mean, I talked with Charlie Hawksmeyer about this. I think it was, what episode was that? Was it episode 53? Something like that. With Dr. Charlie Hawksmeyer at Gilded Goat Brewing. And we talked about, implementing sustainability in a small brewery. And he also mentioned the BA benchmarking system. And that's where he started too. It's like, hey, let's just pull together our utility bills, plug this information in, and we can see how we're doing compared to other breweries. And I think that's a really cool and really easy way, or maybe not easy. It's going to take some effort, right? But it's a good way to start, because you can look and see like, okay, here's all of these other breweries. This is where their energy usage is. Whoa, our energy's way out of whack. Like, what's going on? And then that sort of leads you down the path of, okay, maybe let's see what we can do to cut back. And so when you're using this benchmarking tool, one of the questions I wish I had asked Charlie, but I'm going to ask it of you, what's the single most important piece of information to track? Or is there one?
I think that is different at different times and different for different breweries.
Okay.
So part of the usefulness of the benchmarking tool is figuring that out. So initially for me, that was wastewater, because I was seeing such big numbers for surcharges in that area, which is being addressed. And now I'm interested in CO2 because I'm doing an ROI for CO2 recapture. Okay. So I wanted to know what we're currently spending and how much we're using so I can figure out when that pencils out for us.
I see. Yeah. So it makes sense. It's kind of like application based. So you put this information, you started seeing surcharges, which these surcharges are things we'll talk about after the break, but it's for, I'm guessing you've got too much stuff in your water, right? There's too much biological oxygen demand or too much total suspended solids, which are pretty common wastewater metrics that we'll talk about. But you just got too much stuff in your wastewater, and the wastewater company's going, hey, brewery, you're going to dump this stuff on us. We're going to make you pay for it because it costs us extra money to clean up the water, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'll never forget. I went. There's a regional brewery near where I lived in Austin. It's it's called Real Ale. I don't know why I forgot the name of the brewery there. Real Ale Brewing Company in Blanco, Texas. And Blanco is a really small town. I mean, I don't know the population of it, but it's maybe 15, 20,000 people at the most, I would think. But there's a river called the Blanco River that flows right through it. So Real Ale started in the basement in one of the shops downtown in Blanco, and they're just pulling out of a well that draws directly from the Blanco River. As Real Ale gets bigger, now they're a regional brewery that's making, probably 100,000 barrels a year. They're still pulling water out of that Blanco River, and that's going to be a problem at some point, right? So Real Ale realized this and addressed it. They put in a wastewater treatment facility on site, right? So that they've got water coming in and they're putting water back out so that they're not, clean water back into the Blanco River so that they're not hurting downstreams and they're not, drying out all the people there in Blanco, even though that might make them purchase more beer. Because they need something to drink. But that's a really cool, example. But you don't have to start doing a wastewater, cleanup facility. You can start by just looking at your systems that you're doing there at Georgetown and work that way. So you also mentioned you're doing an ROI on CO2 recapture. That's another really interesting part of benchmarking and baselining, because once you've put this information into the system, if you use the BA system or whatever spreadsheet you're using to collect this information, you've got a whole crap load of data, right? That now you can use to justify things like CO2 recapturing. And I'm guessing that's what you mean, ROI, return on investment. Is it worth it for Georgetown to purchase a CO2 recapture system, right?
Yes, exactly. I find myself doing a lot of ROIs these days.
Yeah. And I mean, I talk about this in a commercial brewery, but that's even the case for home brewers. I mean, if you're out there, just, I don't know. I mean, gas is cheap these days. Propane gas is cheap, but electricity or water consumption, if your water bills are spiking or your electricity usage is spiking, you can track these things and figure out what's going on, what's costing you a whole lot of money. Is my refrigerator not sealing appropriately, and thus it's on all the time? So my cold beer that I've got in my kegerator is just drawing a huge amount of electricity. I mean, these are things that people can do everywhere. And I wanted to ask one other question. This is another question that I should have asked Charlie Hawksmeyer, but I'm going to ask you now too, which is, do you have to track everything?
Oh, definitely not. No. This, like on the BA benchmarking tool, there's a category called offsite waste recycling revenue, and that's something I've never monitored and probably never will. It's super sporadic for us, and maybe I'll get interested in that later, but I think really it's track what is useful for you.
Yeah, and you did that, right? You saw these wastewater surcharges, and you start tracking wastewater and looking for ways to fix it. How long does it take to compile all of this information and put it into a system like the BA's benchmarking tool?
Not that long. I think the first time I did it took me maybe a few hours, and I got really into the nitty gritty of it. I had to make decisions about, do I track based on bill by date or by pay by date? And, what if it's billed in the middle of the month? So it's like, once you make those decisions, then you're just putting in numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because you want to make sure you're being consistent or not missing days, or like, if you've got 20 brewing days in March, but only 15 brewing days in February, you need to know and understand those kinds of things and where those cutoffs are.
Yeah, exactly. And now I have help from Chris, who does accounting stuff and is also Georgetown MVP. She helps me with so much stuff, but that includes, she sends me quarterly summary of our utility costs, and that's super helpful and very easy for her to generate. So that might also be the case for other people.
Yeah, I'm sure most breweries have got that at least in some sort of reportable format already, right? Because you're paying the utilities. Somebody's writing that check somewhere, which means there's a document trail someplace. So you might have easy access to that if you wanted to start just by that, looking at your utility bills. All right, there's two other things that you talked about in your getting started section, and I don't want to miss out on these because I think they're super important. You said make a plan and do your research. Tell us about those.
Make a plan. Okay, yeah. So you've downloaded the benchmarking spreadsheet. You have appointed yourself as sustainability champion.
Appointed yourself. I like that.
Yeah. In my case.
Yeah.
Now what? So you fill in your numbers. There's a few categories you'd like to see a little bit more efficient. That's a great start. And I think that's where the research comes in. So Brewers Association has some really good sustainability manuals. Master Brewers Association of the Americas has good resources as well, lots of presentations and articles. You can also just ask other people what they're doing. I think people in this community are so open to questions, and the BA also has a sustainability subcommittee who you can ask questions, or you can ask me, email me. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here.
Right, exactly. That's the thing. We need to share information. And again, I mentioned that episode with Dr. Charlie Hawksmeyer that I've done on the Brew Lab, but I've done a number of sustainability episodes. But the MBAA podcast has a crap load of sustainability stuff, and it's all really good. So I would encourage people, go check those out if you're interested in sustainability. But again, like you said, the best thing about the craft beer community is our willingness to share information. And so sharing with people like you, Caitlin, across other breweries that are your size or that are in your situation, ways to cut costs, right? To save Manny his money, at Georgetown Brewery. That's really how sustainability starts. So we've started with collecting your data, collecting your information. We've come up to make a plan, do your research to figure out what things you might be able to fix at your brewery. But I think when we want to talk about practical solutions, we need to talk about some practical ways to implement sustainability. That's what you did in the second half of your poster, and that's what we'll do in the next part of the show. So we'll be right back. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. If you're listening to this podcast, then you love beer, like me. And one of the things I love the most about beer is sharing it with other people. It's something that I want to continue to do, and it's something that I want those that come after me to be able to do. And that's a driving factor for me in sustainability discussions, is being able to continue to share beer for the rest of eternity. But sustainability is more than that, right? There's more than just that altruistic goal of taking care of future progeny, right, Caitlin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And you got to look at things like, benchmarking and baselining, like we talked about. We discussed those in the first half of the show. I guess we should start then with giving a few practical tips. Oh, I know where I wanted to start, because you were telling me offline that you've implemented a new soft plastic recycling program at Georgetown. So that's where I want to start. Let's talk about that.
Sure. So implementing a new soft plastics recycling program sounds a little fancier than what I've actually done, which is I switched us to a recycling company. Well, let me back up. So the county where we're in, King County, they don't recycle soft plastics, and I don't like that. Seattle's a big city. We produce a lot of soft plastics, and I don't fully understand why we're not recycling them, but I think maybe it's just, it gets caught in the machinery and it's just really hard for them to recycle that right now. But I did find one nonprofit that is actually able to do that, and they're called Cade. They're a local nonprofit, and they're just down the street from us, and they're great. They're actually a zero landfill company, so that means they're trying to find an outlet for every single thing they receive.
Oh wow.
And there isn't just one outlet for anything.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way, right? Because soft plastics, I mean, you think about in the brewery, the biggest one for most breweries is those malt bags, right? The malt bags, mm-hmm. That's a soft plastic. I mean, I know most breweries aren't able to throw those away, or aren't able to recycle those. So those just get tossed and thrown away, or, made into fun crafts of, for the brewery, mm-hmm. for decorating the brewery. But there's only so much space that you have for those bags, and you need a bunch of malt bags, especially at higher sizes of breweries. And, I think this is a cool one what's the guy's name at Allagash? I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's been trying to champion this for a number of years, is changing the bags that malt comes in, right, into mm-hmm. materials that are recyclable and that don't produce as much waste. Now, that's a long way off, because that requires, a whole bunch of research and testing on, quality and how that impacts malt grains and things. But soft plastics are here for right now. And there are ways to recycle it, but like you mentioned, I mean, it's the same here where I'm at in Corvallis. It was the same where I was at in Texas. Those soft plastics, grocery bags, packing materials, right? The bubble wrap, none of that stuff can be recycled where I'm at. And that's a big deal. And that's a lot of waste for breweries, and a big, hazard to the environment too, right?
I know. Yeah. And I hate it. So that's why I'm so glad to be partnering with Cade now, because they take the malt bags. They also take the plastic film wrap that we also use a lot of that. I'm sure most breweries do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm sure you know, but Hopworks in Portland recently collaborated with Vancouver Plastics and Country Malt Group / Great Western Malting. So they're a hub for local malt bag drop off too, and that's great. Yeah, I don't know exactly the processing that goes into that, but I think they just reuse the bags.
Yeah, but so already right here, we've got two really cool opportunities, right? Like you've got a nonprofit there in Seattle that will take these soft plastics for you. It's possible that there may be nonprofits doing those same things wherever you are listening to this show, right? Wherever your brewery is listening to this show, there may be some place that's local where you can do malt drop, bag pickups or plastic pickups or drop offs, right? That can recycle that stuff. And the second thing is that's a really good one, right? Hopworks and Country Malting Group that have created a malt bag drop-off. I mean, that's really fun. I mean, I think there's got to be distributors around the country, right? Like Houston is a big distribution site for Cargill. Excuse me. And so, I mean, there's distribution sites all over the country. Maybe that's a way that, or maybe that's a way that we can get these soft plastics recycled, which is really cool. And to think about, right? So you see and identify a need. We've got all this waste of soft plastics. Another thing for cost cutting for Manny is that's less waste that is filling up a dumpster that he has to pay for, right?
Yeah, well, it is still filling up a recycling bin.
Well, true. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, but
that is...
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, so I was just going to kind of expand on what the recycling hub, in quotes, is. And so basically we have a pallet with a super sack on it, and we've invited our neighbors to drop in their malt bags and plastic wrap that we then literally just throw in our recycling bin.
Oh, cool. So there's like even a neighborhood component to this. And think about the number of breweries that are in neighborhoods that are trying to create positive relationships with neighbors, right? I mean, breweries can, there's a funny sign outside of this brewery in Eugene called Hop Valley, right across the street from the brewery. There's a house, and this house has a sign out front that says Hop Valley, you stink. And I think it's largely because of the smell, right? During mashing and brewing. And if that was right outside your house a lot, I can understand that. But we can be good neighbors, right, of neighborhoods, and that's one way that you can do it. Set up this recycling hub where your neighbors can come and drop their soft plastics in, and then that gets carted off whenever, and recycled, right? Not just thrown into a landfill where it's going to sit for the next 200 years. So that's a really cool, really practical application. Now, I think a lot of people are going to listen to this and say, okay, well, yeah, that's really specific to Georgetown, and that's specific to, Portland, where they've got this other recycling hub. But no, these things, I would bet, are all over the country. They're just waiting to be found. And so that's a really cool one. Tell us also about like recycling and composting. Do you have any other like applications for recycling and composting in terms of sustainability?
Well, so we're in Seattle, so we have a really good focus on sort of environmental things like recycling and composting. And so we actually have a city, maybe county-wide pickup program. So we just have a compost bin like we do a garbage or recycling. So we're really lucky in that respect. And it's possible that, people, it might have to be private companies. Maybe it's not city sponsored, but that probably exists in a lot of other cities or towns.
Yeah, I would think so too. And composting is so easy to do. I mean, and not necessarily from a brewery perspective, and depending on the size of the brewery. But one of the issues here is like most brewers are getting rid of their brewer's spent grain, right? That spent grain is usually going to a farm somewhere and being used as feed, or it's being burned and used as fuel or something like that. But the trube, right? Hop stuff, right? That can't generally go to farmers because the animals don't like the hop material in it. So you've got all this old dead yeast, you've got all this hop material, maybe fruit purees, seeds, or anything like that. All of that stuff can be composted, right? That stuff is easily composted, in fact. And if it's got live microbes in it, that's a great thing sometimes for compost because it gets things going. And so those are opportunities there to use that waste. So I think that's a really cool thing that hasn't necessarily been explored yet. I'm not sure that people are going to pay you for your spent yeast and all that stuff. But that actually reminds me. So there's other research that's going on here at Oregon State about how to upcycle spent yeast by adding, I think putting them under electricity or like in some sort of electrical component, they'll actually start breaking down a bunch of the compounds that create, total suspended solids or biological on demand. So it's a way to sort of pre-treat your waste before dumping it into the wastewater. So
interesting.
Yeah, something interesting there, and something I think that may come out of some research that may come out of there in a few years. Okay, so recycling and composting. There's other subjects that you mentioned. I'm going to list them real quick, and then we'll break them down. So you mentioned creating standard operating procedures and maintenance plans, doing audits or leak checks, getting staff engagement and buy-in, side streaming, LED lighting, water use, vinyl strip curtains, all of these things. So let's go ahead and start breaking some of those down. So let's start SOPs and maintenance plans.
Sure. Yeah. So I really just listed what I thought was most accessible. But obviously there's tons of different ways people can get started. And so SOPs, I think, are a super easy first way. I mean, it takes some work, but you're already doing these things, so why not standardize them? Mm-hmm. So the motivation for creating SOPs, may it be environmentally focused or not, it doesn't matter because you're being sustainable, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, right? I think about an example of an SOP is like wastewater, or I'm sorry, cleaning solutions, right? And so cleaning solutions are going to get dumped down the drain, or, and there's opportunities to be sustainable with cleaning solutions, right?
Yeah. And one experiment I like to talk about is one of our production managers, Cade. He wanted to use less water when rinsing tanks. So there's a pretty wide range for how long people were rinsing tanks after CIPing, and he wanted to standardize it. So we only used as much water as we needed, right? He did some pretty simple experiments with timing, and what he found worked for us. And I'll just go ahead and say like exactly what he did, because I'm sure people are interested. So it was 30 seconds of cold water rinse, followed by 2 5-minute cycles to fill the tank with cold water. And that it's 2 to 5 minutes to fill the tank with cold water, depending on the tank size. And then 5 minutes of cycling with a pump, and then a 30-second rinse.
Wow.
This was followed by another 2-minute fill and another 5 minutes of cycling. And that was generally all it took to get the tank where we needed it to be.
Wow. That's incredible. Just to be cleaned. And is that a fermentation tank, or is that the kettle or a mash tun, or what are we talking about there?
Oh yeah. That's a fermentation tank.
Oh, interesting. Just to get it rinsed, right? And ready to go.
Rinsed and cooled down.
Yeah. Interesting. That's really cool. Because I mean, I would think a lot of breweries may be doing a 10 or 20 minute, rinse to try to get things rinsed and cooled down. Cool. So there's some standardization there. I think one of the things that I explored too while I was working at Blue Owl Brewing, Jeff had already optimized this because he was committed to sustainability, but it's using the right ratios of chemicals to water, right? I think a lot of people would have are often like doubling concentrations or doing 1.5 times concentration for the manufacturers just so that they can make sure that their beer doesn't get tainted or cleaned. But you don't have to do that, right? I mean, some manufacturers are, you may be able to reduce even below some manufacturers' concentrations, right? And still get your equipment all clean. And the other thing you can do is reuse cleaning water. Right. I think there was a really cool one that I saw was like rinsing the inside of the kettle. Right. And then rinsing the mash tun, and then using that water with like the last rinse on the mash tun. This was from you, right? Using, or was this somewhere else?
I don't think that was me.
Okay. Well, I saw this somewhere else. It's like it's using the last rinse of the mash tun, in the kettle. Right, so you using that as like cleaning water for something else. So it's like taking that last little bit of water that's super hot in your mash kettle that doesn't have very much stuff still in it, and then using that further down in the process where you can reuse that water as you're going along. But like you mentioned, we got off on this talking about SOPs and maintenance plans. The first thing that you have to do is, like you said, you have to set up a standard operating procedure. You need to do some experiments like your brewer did, determine what makes sense for your brewery, and then set it in SOPs. That's a really easy place to start for breweries. And you are, like you said, you're being sustainable. And hey, there's a lot of cost savings if you can reuse chemical solutions and not use as much water and not use as much chemical, so you're not having to replace cleaning solutions all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for reusing water, either as water or heat recovery, and also reusing chemical, which we actually don't do a lot of, and I would like to play with that. So if anyone has any tips and tricks, I'd love to hear it.
Oh yeah. There's definitely some good ones. I mean, I know here at our brewery at Oregon State, Jeff uses has a caustic skid, and so he'll reuse caustic for quite a while until until he does some tests. I'm not going to go all into the details, mostly because I don't exactly know how it works. But he uses and reuses caustic when cleaning the brewery. And I think that's a really nice way to save and prevent overuse of the chemical and such. But let's leave SOPs and maintenance plans there, because there was something that you mentioned at the top of the show, and that's leak checks and audits. And this one, whenever I did episode 63 with Micah Sweeney about electricity use in the brewery, this was a big one that they identified, is just cleaning up leaks in a glycol chiller or in your air supply or your CO2 is a really, really easy way to increase your sustainability, increase your efficiency, and cut your costs.
Absolutely. The EPA's Energy Star program, they have a treasure hunt for microbreweries, which is a nice facility audit. And I think the ideal outcome of that audit is a rigorous maintenance plan. I mentioned earlier, we had a dedicated person, Mark, and he's doing a killer job. That spreadsheet, that's just a dream. It just lists everything that needs to be fixed and when it was and when it needs to be again.
Oh, nice.
And there's other audits you can download too. The BA has some, but the point is maintain your equipment and it'll live longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maintain your equipment. It'll live longer, but it'll also be more efficient too, right? I think it was Micah that was talking about there was a leak in the air flow of something. It was like compressed air. There was a leak in compressed air someplace in one of the breweries that they were looking at, and just fixing that leak would have increased their or decreased their energy consumption by just a huge amount. And it's not something that you would really know. It's just air that's being released, right? It's not CO2 or some gas or something or water that's spraying out of someplace. It's just air that was leaking out, and it was causing I can't remember. I think it was causing the heat source that they were using for the brewery to run overnight or on weekends, or maybe it was the chiller that was running overnight and on weekends and working harder because these leaks were happening throughout the pipes. So you just fix that, and then suddenly you've got a better, more useful system. So audits and leak checks, that's a cool one. One that I want to spend some time on, staff engagement and buy-in. This was cool. So talk to us about staff engagement and buy-in.
So I gave a list of ideas for this category. It was just kind of, random. These are super easy things I think could be implemented tomorrow. And it really just comes down to shifting the company culture. So making the sustainable thing the standard thing. So you make it so people don't even need to choose. This is just what it is. Mm-hmm. So some things I suggested were having a compost program in place, and just we compost. This is what we do. Don't put your food in the trash because it won't compost at the landfill.
Yeah.
Replacing lights, replacing windows with energy efficient windows, shutting down equipment when not in use. Meat-free Mondays is a fun one. I think would be great for people to implement.
Interesting. Yeah.
Reusing stuff, challenging staff to bring new ideas. I think this is an endless list of ways to get people engaged.
Well, sure. And you also mentioned earlier too, right? Like checking in with your staff to make sure that your staff is doing well, right? And that they have what they need and they're doing well in their personal life, not just, while they're at the brewery, but that they're actually, they're being sustainable in their own, in their own personal life. Not necessarily like micromanaging their composting, but I mean are they feeling fulfilled? Are they challenged? Are they happy at work? Are they doing these things that will make them productive members of your brewery or help them be productive members of your brewery? And I had sort of a comment on this too. One of the things that I find sometimes is that I think a lot of brewers, almost everyone wants to be sustainable. I don't think there are very few people out there that are like, no, I just want the world to burn. But there are a lot of processes that are easier and less time consuming if you ignore the environmental impact. And I'll give an example of that. So this didn't happen at Blue Owl because the processes were optimized, but I was thinking about this as we were doing stuff, and it's really easy, like you mentioned, to just rinse a tank, rinse, or just not deal with pre-treating water. So at Blue Owl, we had to implement a system where we neutralize acids and bases before it goes into the wastewater. I think that's happening at a lot of breweries, right? You've got acidic or basic cleaners or sanitizers, and you can't just dump those straight down the drain because it creates it changes the pH and it messes with piping and all this stuff. So it's a problem for wastewater companies. So Blue Owl has a system for managing that. So essentially everything runs off into a tank. It gets pH neutralized and cooled down to the appropriate temperature, and then it gets discharged into the wastewater system. So it's avoiding surcharges for hot water or for, high pH or low pH water. But I was thinking it would be really easy to not do that. It'd be really easy just to dump your, caustic solution straight down the drain and just not worry about it. Dump your 120 or 130 degree, 140 degree caustic right down the drain, and let the wastewater company deal with it. And so I think these are where you have to get staff engagement and buy-in. And like you said, your standard operating procedures, this is the way we do it, is really important. And I think that makes a lot of sense there.
Yeah, I think it is true. It can be easier to not choose the environmentally positive thing to do. And again, it comes down to company culture and also internal motivation. And if you really want to get into the psychology of it all, you can delve into why people care about being more sustainable or don't and target that.
Yeah.
And that can be a tough conversation, but if you can do it, it can really make a difference.
Well, and I think that's where a sustainability champion helps out too, right? Is because then you've got somebody that's looking around and, just sort of making sure that, or not making sure, but helping with that conversation, right? It's like, hey, no, this is why we're doing the things this way, or it's just, hey, I understand why this person is doing that. Let's see if we can help them find a way that's easier, right, on them, that actually makes something easier. So I think that's a really cool idea. If you've got that sustainability champion, there's a real opportunity there for that person to have a really meaningful impact on, like you said, acceptance of sustainability programs and creating the sustainability programs in the first place. Another one that's cool, that this one gets a lot of attention, I think, because there are surcharges that are placed on wastewater, but it's side streaming, and specifically, I think one that you mentioned in your paper was wastewater.
Yeah, so this is such a big one. I'm sure everyone's heard about this. And I think my main source for this was Campbell Morrissey, who is the head brewer at Freem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he's been on the show.
Yeah, he has actually. Yeah, Campbell's a friend. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's also just ridiculously smart. He gave a talk at the Master Brewers District Northwest meeting last spring, 2022. And, that was just perfectly comprehensive. So side streaming, pretty accessible option that I think most breweries do. It's what we do is we dump our spent grain in a trailer that gets picked up daily by a local farmer. And I think he picks up for a lot of breweries in and around Seattle. He feeds it to his cows, like you mentioned earlier. And I know some people pay or get paid for this. We don't do either of those. We just get waste hauled off and Eddie gets free feed for his cows. So we all benefit. We also side stream the fermenter blow off yeast and sort of hot particulate that is left over after fermentation. And we put that in a dedicated tank, and actually a local organic fertilizer company picks it up.
Oh, cool.
And also any solids that go down the drain end up in the stream as well, like spilled hops, grain, etc. And it's the same as with the spent grain. We both benefit and nobody pays anybody.
Yeah.
And then after that, the remaining liquid is pH adjusted, temperature adjusted, like you were talking about, and sent to the treatment plant. And because it's got such high organic matter still, we do get surcharges. Mm-hmm. And we do use pH control, like you were talking about, caustic and like sulfuric acid. There's a lot of good resources there's brewerywastewater.com actually has a lot of really good information.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that existed, but that's a cool one. brewerywastewater.com. Yeah. I'm
yeah, check it out.
Peruse that one.
One option we're actually looking at for our wastewater problem is a dedicated centrifuge for our wastewater. So this wouldn't completely solve our problem, but we would still need to do some biological treatment, such as a digester or reverse osmosis, but it would be a step in the right direction and would probably eliminate our surcharges.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? And I think the more that brewers get interested in these technologies, the more these technologies become accessible, right, and cheaper. I'm not suggesting that Georgetown specifically needs to be the guinea pig, right, that pays all of the upfront cost. But I think there are opportunities. An interesting one that seems like it has a high upfront cost, but really will pay dividends over the length of the brewery is LED lighting. And that's an example of one that you had in your paper too. That's huge in my opinion. Just from my own personal story, I love Christmas. And so I kind of do Clark Griswold, vacation level Christmas lights in front of my house. And I realized like how much my electricity bill goes up whenever I put Christmas lights out there. So I've started making the switch to LED lights, and the lights are brighter. There's more color to them. I can do more things with them. And that really, really reduces my energy bills. So that's just my own personal experience with LED lighting. But for breweries, I can imagine it'd be the same.
Yeah. And LEDs also last longer and are recyclable at some facilities. More benefit.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's water use, like I talked about, proper dilution of chemicals, reusing or recirculating chemicals. And then one that was on here, this was a big takeaway from the episode that I did with Dr. Charlie Hawksmeyer, and that was vinyl strip curtains. That was a really cool one, and that one was also listed on your paper as well.
Yeah, that episode was great. It was a really great resource for my poster.
Well, good. I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah. The vinyl curtains, they just, they keep the cold in, they keep the outside temperature out, and it's, you got to keep that door open for minutes at a time, right? So anything we can do.
Yeah, and he pointed out that when he was doing his benchmarking, he realized that like the chilling system, the keeping beer cold was costing them a lot of money at Gilded Goat. I mean, that was a big source of their energy. And I think even Micah Sweeney talked about that too, in the Electricity and Brewery Use podcast. Is the chiller is taking up huge amounts of energy for the brewery in terms of electricity use at minimum. What about sustainable ingredient sourcing? Is that a thing yet?
Totally. Supply chain stuff is hard. It's complicated because before and after it's in the brewery, it's just harder to account for things. That said, salmon safe malt and hops are ever expanding. We've used them a few times and would love to do more. Right now, we can only do it on our smaller brew house, but it would be great if that continued in popularity.
Yeah, Salmon Safe is pretty cool. If you haven't checked that out, check that out. I think it's salmonsafe.org is the website for that. It's a really, really cool program, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest, protecting us fish species because of watering and irrigation of hops and malt. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool partnership there between the craft beer industry and the fishing industry.
Yeah, and I think a good way to be more responsible about that is to have closer relationships with suppliers and buy from certified growers and suppliers. So certifications like Salmon Safe, organic, regenerative, anything sort of environmentally responsible. I don't know if B Corp certified farms exist, but if they do, I want to buy from them.
Yeah.
I trust B Corp.
Yeah, for sure. And there's an episode that I did recently with Ryan Gregory where we talked about CO2 equivalent emissions for insect and pesticides, and how essentially depending on the amount of insecticide and pesticide that was used, it varies based on the hop variety. So there are some hop varieties that have much lower CO2 equivalent emissions because they're more hardy plants, right? They require less insect or pesticide intervention. So I think at some point there might even be ways to choose, hop varieties or make a decision sustainably based on, all right, if I choose this hop, that means I'm also contributing to the environment because this is I don't know what the certification might look like, but maybe someday there's going to be, environmentally sustainable hops or something, or like low CO2 equivalent emission hops or something like that. So we got a couple minutes left, but let's sort of go through what do we see as the future of sustainability?
Well, for Georgetown, I think that's CO2 recapture. So I talked about that earlier. I think that can work for us, especially with the current and impending CO2 shortages. Mm-hmm. We've been a little bit isolated from that, but we're going to feel the effects inevitably. I think also solar panels would be great. I'm working on an ROI for that.
Yeah.
It's all more complicated than you think it is and takes longer than you hope it will.
Always, as everything does. I think Matt Winans was just joking about that with Imperial's Capri yeast is this new hybrid strain of yeast. He called it I-22 and 22 was too long to make. But sure, yeah. I mean, that's how it always works. And ROI decisions are very, very difficult and very complicated and that involve a lot of sophisticated guesswork, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that CO2 recapture device or CO2 recapture, I think is something that may be quicker or more reasonable than a lot of people think it is. I think a lot of the CO2 recapture systems out there are expensive, but I think we forget how much CO2 we produce as part of a brewery, right? As part of that fermentation reaction. And where's that CO2 going? It's all just mostly getting vented out of the keg, right? It's going into a little Home Depot bucket that's bubbling.
Yeah. And if you're packaging, you're using a lot of CO2.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just, yeah. And then you're breathing that in and, we make CO2, we use CO2. Why can't we just close that loop? It's harder than it seems.
It is hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's companies now that are making small units for real small breweries, under 10,000, under 1,000 barrels. So it's becoming more and more accessible.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, there's just so many ways to think about this. That was one other takeaway from Micah Sweeney's episode was using a heat pump, which is essentially like when your chiller is chilling your glycol, there's heat that's radiating off of that chiller. And there are new systems called heat pumps that can take that heat and pump it over into your boiler stream or whatever you're using to heat up your kettle and things like that. And so you're reusing that energy. You can take that heat and keep things warmer or start from warmer water. I don't really understand all the mechanics of it, but it's a really cool opportunity that may be available for breweries and maybe relatively inexpensive to install, which is cool too. So,
yeah, and actually, one thing we do is so we have our heat exchanger, right? That we do heat recovery from. Yeah. So we have So the heat exchanger is fed with cold liquor, and then hot work goes into the heat exchanger, and that heats up that cold liquor, which then goes into the plant hot liquor tank. So we recovered that heat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really cool one, and I think there are a number of breweries that are doing that already. But there are a surprising number of breweries that aren't. I remember that was another big takeaway from Micah Sweeney's episode. Is just the number of breweries that were in the San Diego area that didn't have any sort of recapture device for that heat. You probably largely because of they're not brewing as frequently. If they were putting the hot liquor back or hot water back into a liquor tank, if it's sitting for 3 or 4 days, it's going to come to room temperature anyway. But still, then you've got water, there that's ready to be brewed with, and not just getting run down the drain or something like that. But yeah, there's so many of these ways: solar panels, CO2 recapture, wastewater pretreatment, all of these really fun things. And there's really just too many of these to even come up with. I usually try to end the episode with key takeaways, right? Like, what did we learn from this episode? But hopefully, there's a crap load of practical applications that you got from this episode. But I do want to ask you this question that I ask all my guests, and it's if you want brewers to take away just one thing from this episode, what would it be?
Oh boy. I think baseline metrics are a really great first step. Use the BA benchmarking tool. Other things that are easy right out the gate: LED lighting, SOPs, side streaming, recycling, and compost. And those are all things we talked about.
Yeah, nice. I love it. I love that. Benchmarking, collecting data. I love collecting data, but then being able to use it. And like you said, apply some of these practical applications. And if you have the ability to, check out Caitlin's poster. But is there anything else that you want to talk about? I mean, about sustainability that we didn't get to today?
One, I am curious about the use of extracts to reduce hop usage.
Oh, okay.
And two, email me. I want to talk to everyone about sustainability at their brewery. Caitlin at georgetownbeer.com.
There you go. Caitlin at Georgetown Beer. If you've got a question about sustainability, please reach out to her. You reach out to me too, and I'll be happy to forward your information on. Interesting about hop extracts. That's a topic I want to get on the Brew Lab soon. How are hop extracts made? What's the energy consumption? All that sort of stuff. And it turns out I know some people at Haas, so I might be able to get somebody on the lab to talk in the lab to talk about it. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for talking about sustainability, for your commitment and what you're doing at Georgetown Brewery, and also for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Thank you so much for having me, Cade.
All right. Well, listeners, in the show notes, you will find a link. It's a link to the abstract of the poster that Caitlin presented at the Brewing Summit in 2022. But it's a really awesome poster. And if you have access to that content, the poster is titled Sustainable Beer, Practical Applications of Sustainability in Your Brewery. And also, don't miss out on the Brewlosophy podcast, and be sure to check out all of the other fun stuff we're doing at brewlosophy.com. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.